Hello and welcome back. This is the week 12 lecture. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. I really would like to turn our attention to our final paper, the biggest grade of the semester. This is the literary research paper. So many of us have probably written something similar in the past, maybe in your 203 or your 223 class. But I just want to talk a little bit more generally about the assignment both this week and next week. So I'm actually going to cover a couple of sort of preliminary things this week. I want to talk about research, and I want to talk about what we call pre-writing, that first stage of the writing process when you're taking notes, brainstorming, and outlining. Getting organized, getting a plan ready for the drafting stage. Drafting, of course, just means writing. We're not ready to do that yet. Maybe by next week, we will be. So this week I want to focus on research and pre-writing, and then next week we'll talk more about the paper itself. We'll talk more about how to build it, the kinds of paragraphs we need, and how to start, producing the kind of original material, the original analysis that we want. So these will be the final two lectures of the semester here in week 12, and then the very last one will be the week 13 lecture next week. We won't have any new material in week 14 or week 15. We will just be working on our final papers. But I would like to meet with each of you individually for video conferences during week 14. So I will publish a schedule. We'll try to get all that worked out a little bit later, but I would like to meet with each of you during that week so we can talk about the paper. And then in week 15, I won't have anything new for you. You will simply be working and getting ready to submit your final draft. So let's talk a little bit today about research. I really wanted to devote, for the most part, an entire lecture to research because we need to make sure that we're conducting the right kind of research. We need to find the right kinds of sources for this final paper, and that means we need to be looking in the right places. We're not going to find great sources if we're not looking in great places. So I know we're all familiar with research. We've all done it before in previous classes for previous assignments. So I don't want to bore you. I don't want to spend too much time on review because I know we're already familiar with a lot of the basics that go into this process. But I guess the big point that I wanted to make today is that the kind of research that you do in a class like this, in a 300 level literature class, is of course quite different than the research that you might have done back at the 100 level or even on the 200 level. So the expectations are higher now. I'm expecting a higher caliber of source. And I'm also expecting for you guys to start looking in actual, academic journals. Academic journals devoted to the study of literature. And I'll talk about some specific examples in a moment. And I also want you guys to be using the GBC library databases. So I know you've heard about the databases before. I know somebody at some point has probably shown them to you. I do this in my 101 and my 102 classes. At the 200 level, you probably heard more about the databases. So we're probably already familiar. But I just wanted to introduce you to a couple of maybe new databases that you can use. And also I want to mention some specific journals. These are the types of journals that you need to be looking in. Not all of them are going to be useful, of course, for everybody, but these are just examples of the types of academic sources that we want. So let's just say a few words about Google, because of course, oftentimes this is where our research begins and ends, is with a Google search. So I see this a lot, of course, most instructors do, and frankly, savvy 101 and 102 students often don't have to do anything beyond Google. Because as we all know, probably by now, you can find good sources just by doing a Google search. I'm not going to sit here and deny that. It is true. If you search for your chosen text, the text you're going to write about, or if you search for the author, chances are Google will produce some good results if you go through the many, many results that you're going to get. And see, therein lies part of the problem. Google will certainly yield good search results, but it can sometimes be difficult to sift through the enormous number of hits that you get, especially if your text is very popular, if it's been around for a while, if the author is famous. You're going to get a ton of search results, probably in the thousands, maybe at least in the 100s. So, of course, we can't look through all of those. But the challenge is always to find the good stuff and to leave out the less good stuff. But see, Google isn't really going to necessarily always rank that stuff in a way that's going to really work well for us. So sure, there's going to be some good articles, some good books that show up, some good potential sources that show up in that Google search, but it's often difficult to find the results that we really want. And another thing that you've probably noticed before is that there's no guarantee, if you're just using Google, there's no guarantee that you'll actually have free access to the sources that are coming up in your search results. This is also a problem with Google Scholar. Another thing that I show my students going back to the 100 level. So maybe some of you have used Google Scholar before. I definitely talk about it in 203. It's a pretty good resource for students. It works just like Google, with the only difference being that all of your search results will be scholarly academic sources. And see, you don't get that with regular Google. With regular Google, you'll get some academic stuff. You'll also get Wikipedia. You'll get SparkNotes. You'll get all of the innumerable summary websites, paper mills, we call them. I'm sure we've seen those before. The places where you can go and get a summary on a text, or maybe, and of course we don't do this, but less scrupulous students might even visit some of those sites where they can buy a term paper or read what other people have said, right? Those sites are going to come up. Wikipedia is going to come up, right? And those aren't valid sources. So Google Scholar is better because all of your results will be good. They're all going to be academic, peer-reviewed, scholarly sources. So I assume we all kind of know what that means. We've all learned what an academic source is. The key, what really makes academic sources more reliable, and you guys probably know this, is the fact that they are peer-reviewed. Which means before publication, these articles or books have to get reviewed by other experts in the field, other literature scholars, other people who know a lot about the subject matter. So that's just an extra level of vetting that we like, because it means that this stuff, it is reliable. Other people have signed off on it. If they're, other scholars, other academics, other experts have signed off on it. And if there were any problems or issues in that particular article, it would have gotten smoothed out. People would have called attention to it, and it would have been corrected, before that article appears in a journal. So we like that. We like that, and that's what makes academic sources a little bit different from, a newspaper article or something that you might find in a popular magazine. Sometimes those can be useful sources depending on the context, not so much in here, but in other classes, certainly in 102, a lot of people use newspaper articles. But we want scholarly sources, and for the most part, those will come from professors, other writers, other people who are studying these texts, have studied these authors and have created interpretations and readings of their own that you can use. Sometimes they'll support your own interpretation, and then in other cases you might be disagreeing with the scholars and critics. That's fine too. But Google Scholar's good. You're going to get good search results. But again, we have a similar problem to what I mentioned with regular Google. You might not have free access to all of the articles that pop up in your search results. So I say this to my 100 level students as well. You should never pay for a source. So a lot of times, if you're using Google Scholar, you might click on one of your search results and you'll end up on a web page. And in some cases, you might be able to read the article for free on that web page. And if that's what you're able to do, great, you win. But about half the time, or maybe 30 to 40% of the time, you're going to hit a paywall. You're going to end up on a site, and it's often the site that's perhaps, managed or maintained by the academic society or by the organization that creates whatever academic journal you're looking at. Often they have websites. Everything's digital now. But sometimes these academic societies or organizations, or in some cases it might even be school-based organizations from different colleges and universities, or it might even be the publisher. They're often going to want you to pay. If you want to read the article, if you want to read the book chapter, great. Just sign up for a subscription and you'll have free access to all of our stuff. Don't do that unless you just really want to be a member of that academic society, or you really want to pay dues every month to, get a free, edition of their latest journal. You don't need to pay. Because anything that you want, any academic source that you might want, can be found for free using the GBC library databases. So what I would suggest is that if you find something on Google Scholar and you're like, oh, I want this article, this sounds good, this looks like something I can use, you'll often be able to read an abstract of these sources. That just means like a brief summary, kind of giving you an overview of what the source is about. So if you read the abstract, you know a little bit about this source and you want it, but you're hitting a paywall, that's fine. Just jot down the title of the source, maybe the author name, and you can search for it later when you're looking inside the GBC databases. And anything you find in the databases, you'll have full access to the full text, whether that means a PDF file or maybe an HTML file. But either way, you'll be able to read the source in its entirety. And that's, of course, very important. I know that seems like kind of a silly thing to point out, but as you can probably imagine, we have a lot of students, not so much at this level, but at the lower levels, who will sometimes just they'll use a source even though they're not able to actually read it. They'll just use the abstract, or maybe they find a review of that article and they're like, yeah, people say this is really good. So they'll try to use it even though they haven't actually read it. I'm sure we wouldn't try anything like that in here, but I do see that a lot in 102 or even 203. And again, that's a student who didn't want to pay for the source, but they also didn't bother to just look for that source in our databases. And if they had done that, they could have found it for free and then they could have read it. So obviously, I don't look favorably upon using sources that we can't actually read. That never works. Okay, so we want academic journals, in some cases books, written by critics and scholars. It's been peer reviewed, and obviously it needs to be relevant to whatever we are writing about. So let's kind of walk through our process a little bit here, sort of thinking about how we're going to get started. Because this is a big project, and as you can see, I want us to break up this final paper, and the way we approach it, I want to break it up into different stages, different steps, and I want us to take our time. This paper is not something that you're going to be able to write in a day or a night or even a couple of days. Like I said, this week is all about researching and getting started on pre-writing. And then next week, we might continue to outline and get organized, make a plan. You might not be writing until week 14. And that's fine. You'll be meeting with me that week. We can talk about your draft. If you have a rough draft, we can look at it. If you only have an outline finished by that point, we can just look at that. You'll have weeks 14 and 15 to really devote to writing. So we're not there yet. I want to start at ground zero, which means choosing a topic, getting started on research, and then starting some early idea generation stuff that we do with pre-writing. So let's start with the obvious. You need to choose a text. Any text found within our book. I really would like you to stick to our book, the one we've been using all semester. It's got a ton of stuff in it. I've only assigned a relatively small percentage of the overall literary text that can be found in the book. So just pick a text, any text in the book. I don't care. It can be a short story. It can be a play. It can be a poem. You could also use Cannery Row, our one example of a novel that we looked at this semester. So you can choose anything that I've assigned. Any of our assigned readings are fair game. But you can also pick something that I have not assigned, but it's in the book. So just go to the table of contents. If you've already read something that you really enjoyed, you're really interested in it, and you want to work with it further, great. Use that. If it's something we've read as a class, great. But also feel free to explore and check out some other texts that I did not assign, and you might find something on your own that you really like. Another thing to remember is I don't mind if you return to a text that you wrote about in one of your in one of your short analytical responses. Okay, one of our SARs. So by the time we're really moving on the paper, you'll have we've already completed our third SAR. That's right. I just haven't graded it yet. I've graded the first two. You guys have already submitted the third. I just haven't gotten a chance to grade them yet, but I will soon. So we're actually done with those, and that's great. You can go back through all three of them. You might want to wait until I've graded SAR 3, but you can go back and, if there's something promising that you were doing in one of those SARs, and you want to pursue it further, you can do that. And sometimes that works pretty well. I see this a lot in 300 and 400 level classes where, we're pursuing a particular text or a particular entry point, particular feature of that text in one of our short responses, but we just don't have the space or the time to develop all of our ideas sometimes in one of those SARs. So we want to go back to that material, but elaborate on it, do more with it, develop a more sort of complex argument about it in our big paper. And you can do that. But that does not mean I want to just see recycled material. If you're going to go back to stuff that you were doing in one of the SARs, update it, improve it. Don't just cut and paste. You can write about the same text. You can make some of the same points. And yeah, maybe a sentence or two can be the same, but you really need to put a new spin on that stuff and make it work with all of the new material that you're creating, because obviously we have to write a lot more for the final paper than we have been for these SARs. Okay? But yeah, use what we've been doing. Use the book. Use your previous assignments. You can even go back to a discussion post. Maybe you were sort of getting into some really interesting stuff in one of those posts, but you just didn't have time to do everything that you wanted to do. So maybe you want to return to one of those as well. But that's obviously step one. Choose your topic, and for us that means a text. Any text in our book, it doesn't matter what type of literature it is. Now, I will say this. If you're going to do a novel, if you're going to do a play, and usually if you're going to do a short story, you just need one text. I know sometimes we want to do a comparison We want to compare two different texts. And that can work. I wouldn't rule it out. Again, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. If you're looking at two relatively short stories, yeah, you could probably handle both. If you're looking at two short poems, that would probably work. But oftentimes, one text is enough. Even if it's a pretty lengthy poem, it doesn't have to be super long, but even a decently lengthed lyric poem can give you enough for an entire paper, right? People produce entire papers, entire books sometimes on individual poems. So sometimes, I think students have a tendency to sort of worry about, I'm not going to have enough to say about this one story. I need something else. I need to bring in another story. I need a third text. I need to compare it to Harry Potter or something else contemporary, right? I mean, we sometimes worry that we're not going to have enough, so we kind of overcompensate and we bring in too much, and then we get overwhelmed. So most of the time, you'll just need a single text, particularly if it's of a decent length. Like if you're doing Cannery Row, don't write about anything else. Cannery Row gives you more than enough material for an entire paper. If you want to do Sweat or, even just a short story, most short stories will sustain an entire paper all by themselves. So if you want to do a comparison, if you want to choose multiple texts, I'm not going to automatically say no, but yeah, you want to run that by me, and you'll have a chance to do that soon. So at the end of week 13, not this week, but next week, you guys are turning in your proposals and critical summaries. So I'll talk a little bit more about that assignment next week, but basically it's just a way for you to show me that you've started your research, so you can talk about a couple of the sources that you found by the end of next week. And you can also just kind of briefly tell me what your argument is going to be. Obviously, you mentioned the text that you're writing about, and then just give me an overview of what you want to do with it, what you want to say about it. That's the proposal part. We've all written proposals before. It's pretty informal, but I want to look at those at the end of week 13 so I can sign off on everybody's plan. Okay, so make your selections, choose your text, and this can be a very personal, kind of emotional decision. It's fine to just pick a text that you like, just something that you enjoyed reading. But remember, you have to move beyond that emotional response. You ultimately have to make an original argument about that text. These are very much argumentative. This is very much an argumentative paper. Okay, so when you're making your decision, yeah, it's fine to choose something at first because I just liked it, I thought it was good, but then ask yourself, what can I say about it? What can I do with it? What is an original contribution that I can make to the critical conversation surrounding this text? And if you get a little stumped, it's okay. Sometimes it's a process of elimination. Sometimes you'll pick a short story. Oh, I like this one. I enjoyed reading this. And then you think about it a little bit more. You do a quick little search. You do a little bit of reading online, and you might start to realize, I like this story, but I don't really have that much to say about it. I don't have a whole, complex analysis that I can really get into about this. So I'll pick something else. Sometimes liking a text does not always equal having a lot to say about it. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes the two match up and correspond, but it's fine to start by choosing something based on affection. I like it, but then the next part is, do I have something to say about it? Can I make an argument about it? And think a little bit more about that. So once you have your topic, then you can start researching. So like I said, it's never a bad idea, once you've selected your text, to just do a quick Google search. I mean, sure, you're not married to anything that you find on that initial search. You really just need to kind of get acquainted with the text a little bit more. Learn the publication history. A lot of that might not factor that much into your paper, but you just need to know it. What year was it published? Definitely write that down. Who's the author? Make sure you're getting their name right. You might want to look at their Wikipedia page. If it's a famous author, they will have one. You might just want to acquaint yourself with some basic biographical details. When did this author live? When did this author die? What are some other, maybe the author's still alive if it's a contemporary text, but you could also look at what else they've written. What are some other famous short stories or poems or novels by them? Whatever. This takes just a matter of minutes, right? This is not a big time investment. Just do a quick search, learn some basics, but also remember what I mentioned last week about learning about the critical conversation. I want to return to that because that's part of what you need to do this week as well. What are people saying about this text? You need to read some stuff that has been written about the text. And not all of that will end up being sources for you. Not all of that's going to, end up in your paper. You're just educating yourself. You're just learning more about your chosen topic. And a lot of times this is very easy because there's almost always sort of a dominant interpretation, especially if it's a really famous text, like a short story by Flannery O'Connor or Cannery Row by John Steinbeck or a sonnet by Shakespeare. People have been interpreting those texts, writing about those texts, teaching those texts for decades. In the case of Shakespeare, for centuries, right? So there's a lot of stuff out there. And you're not responsible for reading all of it or knowing all of it, but you are responsible for knowing some of it and reading some of it. Again, not everything you read will end up being a source that you include on your paper. Sometimes you're just learning stuff that's just helping you become more knowledgeable and more confident. You might never specifically mention it in your paper, but it's knowledge that you now possess. And it's making you more prepared to embark on this level of analysis. And again, we need to know sort of what that critical conversation is. Like, have there been debates about the text, right? Because again, there's often going to be sort of one or maybe a couple of dominant interpretations that keep showing up. Right? These are the interpretations that we can find on the paper mills, on the summary websites, where younger students often go to find the answers to questions they have to answer or to find ideas for their own work. And again, we don't want to do that. But we've all been on those sites. We know that they're often providing the sort of most common, most taught, most accepted interpretation of a text. So it doesn't hurt to know what that most dominant interpretation is. Or maybe there's a couple. Maybe there's two. And they're kind of at odds. There's one camp of critics who says, no, it means this. And then there's another camp that says, no, it means this other thing. And maybe they've been battling back and forth for decades. Maybe you can find an example of the one viewpoint, and then you can find another example of the contrasting interpretation or viewpoint. A lot of times, you guys will see this, critics and scholars will sometimes respond to each other directly, like by name. And in other cases, they'll just refer to a particular camp or a particular school of thought. This is what many people have said, but I think that's wrong. Here's what I'm going to say. So again, it's often very much framed as a debate, or at least as an ongoing sort of just conversation, where there are different viewpoints, different perspectives, and you need to be aware. At least in a general way. You need to be aware of that conversation. I probably already shared this metaphor with you guys. It's kind of cheesy. I say it a lot, but just keep it in mind. Entering a critical conversation, it's kind of like entering a party a little bit late. A lot of people are already there. They're already talking. You're not just going to barge into a conversation before you understand what it's about. So if you're sort of a normal person, you're probably going to listen, right, to what people are saying, get some context, understand the conversation, and then you might be ready to enter it with ideas, opinions, thoughts of your own. And that's largely what we're doing here in the early stages of research. We're just figuring out, okay, what are people saying? What's some stuff that's already been written? And what are some of the dominant interpretations or viewpoints that are already out there concerning this text? And again, reading through a lot of that might also help you to arrive at your own thesis, your own original interpretation. You might sort of formulate that in opposition to something that somebody else is saying. Or you might decide, you know what, I agree with what this one scholar is saying, but now I'm going to add something to it. I'm going to add something new to this basic foundation that this other, scholar or critic is helping me to lay down. So a lot of times that reading will help you find your own entry point, your own argument, your own original contribution. So you can be very informal. Again, it's all right to start with just a few Google searches, but once you're ready to start actually finding sources, I would maybe start with Google Scholar, like I was saying. That's a step above just regular old Google. You're going to get academic peer-reviewed search results, but a lot of them might cost money. So you can start with Google Scholar, see what you can find. You might be able to grab some free PDFs of particular articles or book chapters. That's great. But then the next step is to do what I want us to do right now, which is go to the library homepage, the GBC library homepage, and then let's visit the databases. So I'm assuming you guys are at least somewhat familiar with the library website. You've probably been here before, but if not, that's okay. It's not very difficult to use. If you go to the GBC homepage, just the school homepage, you should see the tab for library up in that upper sort of right-hand corner of the screen, or somewhere up there at the top. Just click on that, and then you'll land on the library homepage. And once you're there, if you scroll down a little bit, you should see some options underneath Library Quick Resources. You should see a little heading that says Library Quick Resources, and then you have like 4 things underneath that. Tutorials, the online catalog, something for ebooks, and then databases. So feel free to explore anything that you find on the library page. You don't have to go straight to databases, but that's the most important thing for us. And just a quick little note here, you will have to log in to the library in order to gain remote access. Don't let that be a barrier to your ability to use the databases. I see this a lot in my 101 and 102 classes. A lot of students don't use the databases because they can't log in to the library. And they just kind of throw their hands up and say, well, guess I can't use the databases. I'm just stuck with Google and Wikipedia. Oh well. And then, of course, their research suffers, as you can imagine. And I kind of understand that with freshmen. They don't really know what's going on, and they often don't know how to retrieve their username and password. They often don't know how to access their email. A lot of them aren't even logging into Canvas, so as you can imagine, it can often be a mess with them. But at this level, at the 300 level, I'm assuming that you guys can log in to the library. I'm assuming you have your username and password. It might be the same as what you use for your email or Canvas. I'm not really sure, but that's up to you guys. And if you're having trouble logging in right now, or if you try later today and you have an issue, it's very easy to fix. You can call technology services. They can retrieve a username or password for you. Or you guys are all pretty internet savvy, I'm imagining. You can probably just figure it out for yourself. It might take a little bit of time, but you need to be able to log in. It's just mandatory for the kind of research that we need to do at this level. So if you're having trouble, if you can't log in and you can't figure out what's wrong and you're not getting any help from technology services or computer services, you should see a number for them on the library homepage. You can also call the library or email them, ask them directly. I would recommend taking those options first, and if you're still stumped, come to me. I am not tech support. I am not particularly good in that area, but I can at least point you in the right direction and I can, try to help. But you have to get access to the library databases. So if that requires a little bit of work, do that now. Do that early this week so it's not a problem later. Okay, so once you're logged in, and you might not get prompted to log in until after you click on databases, but go ahead and click on that tab now. It's underneath the online catalog and the tutorials, and it should be right next to ebooks. Click on databases, and then you'll end up on another page. And maybe you guys have been here before because you probably used EBSCO or maybe JSTOR. So when you land on the main database page, you'll see quick links to both EBSCO and JSTOR. And again, maybe you've used those before. Those are the most commonly used databases by undergraduates because, especially with EBSCO, it's like a one-stop shop. I mean, you can do any kind of research through EBSCO. It doesn't matter what your topic is, what kind of class you're in. It doesn't matter the academic discipline. You can find stuff on EBSCO. EBSCO, I think, is really like a big database that contains a bunch of other smaller databases. So EBSCO's great, and you guys have probably used it before. I'm hoping you used it in 102. I try to get my 102 students to use it, maybe in a 200 level class, but chances are you're probably familiar with EBSCO. And you can still use EBSCO. I'm not going to tell you not to, but there's a better way. There's a better database that I want you guys to at least browse a little bit. You don't have to find all of your sources through it, but I want you to at least try it on for size. And it's called MLA International Bibliography. Maybe we've used this before. If you took Dr. Cooley's 203 class, and I don't think many of us did, he probably made you guys use this database. I don't make my 203 students do it, but I probably should. But the time has come. We should all be using it now. So you guys probably know that MLA stands for the Modern Language Association, so they make a lot of the rules and regulations that we have to follow in English class pertaining to citations and formatting and other things like that. So this is their sort of official database where you find basically any kind of articles or books that you might need for the type of research that you're doing in high-level English classes. So we don't really need MLA International Bib for 101 or 102, but once we get into advanced literature classes, we need it, right? Because this is going to be the place where we're going to find the best literary sources, the best sources that are specifically about literature, and in many cases, American literature. Because a lot of what I assign, not all, but a lot of what I assign this semester is American lit. We also read some British lit, and it really doesn't matter. You guys can pick something from England, from the States. We might even have a smattering of international titles, but I don't really think so. Not in our book. It's mostly American with a little bit of British. So a lot of times you're going to want to look in American literature journals, scholarly journals devoted to the study of American literature. That's what we want. That's the kind of work that we're doing. And again, a lot of that stuff will show up in a basic EBSCO search, but it might be harder to find because EBSCO is kind of like Google. It's going to give you a ton, whereas MLA International Bib will give you more focused, specific search results. So when you're on that main database page, instead of just immediately going to EBSCO, check out the alphabetical listing of databases. You should see a button for that. Click on the alphabetical listing, go to the letter M for MLA, and you'll see that one. You'll see MLA International Bib listed under the M's. Click on it, and then you're going to end up on a new page that looks just like EBSCO. Okay, the interface, the usability is all the same. It looks just the same as a standard EBSCO search. All the buttons and the whole page setup, it all pretty much looks the same. But you should notice once you've selected MLA International Bib, you should notice that it will say something like searching MLA International Bib in EBSCO because that's one of the databases contained within EBSCO. But now we're just looking for stuff in MLA International Bib. We're not looking at all this other stuff that may or may not pertain to our text. So it's just a way to sift through all of the results, get better results, to kind of narrow our number of results to ensure that all of our results are good and to just give us a higher probability of locating and using quality sources. But just like any other search that you've done, remember you have a lot of options. You can always narrow the terms of your search. And again, I hope we've done this before, maybe in 102 or maybe in a 200 level. You know, you can select your date range. We don't necessarily always like old sources, right? Things change. Ideas change, interpretations change. So it might be useful to go back and get something about Cannery Row from the 1950s, I don't know. But we probably have new, fresh, better scholarship that's been conducted more recently. So unless you want to make a point that, something that some interpretation that was popular in the 50s is different from how we look at the book today, or it contrasts with this new historicist approach that people are taking now, that might be useful. But if you're just going to find an old source from the 50s and then rely on it for a lot of your evidence, that's not as effective because chances are a lot's changed in the study of that text since that old article came out 60, 70 years ago. So you might want to play around with your date range. You might want to, push it up and say, I don't want anything from before the year 2000. I don't want anything before 1990. Again, that's just going to narrow your results. You can also choose what kinds of publications you're looking at. You can choose, and you should always choose to see full text. Okay, that's another option that you should see over on that left-hand toolbar once you're inside the database. You want all of your results to be full text. That means PDF or HTML. If it's not full text, it's not really going to help you because you're not going to be able to read the entire thing. But again, here, unlike Google Scholar, once you select full text, everything will be free. You don't have to pay for anything. You don't have to sign up for anything. You'll just need to download some of those PDF or, in some cases, other types of files. But again, figure out a system. I would recommend downloading any sources that look promising. save them or download them to your computer. You might want to create a new folder where you're putting all of your potential sources so they're all in one place, so you don't lose them, so you don't have to go back and look for them again at some future date. Okay, so there's a couple of other databases that you might want to keep in mind. I want you to start with MLA International Bib. You can also use JSTOR. There's going to be some good literature sources within JSTOR. You could also use EBSCO if nothing else is really working, but I would also recommend Project Muse. Okay, Project Muse, you'll find that in the alphabetical listing of the databases. Just go to the letter P, okay, and you should see it. That's another good one that you can use. But MLA International Bib might be all that you need. Start there, see what you find, and then you can try a few other databases as well. All right, so let me just give you some examples of academic journals devoted to the study of literature, often American literature. I'm not saying you have to use like X number of these, but I just want you to write some of these down. I'll also put this in next week in our upcoming module for week 12. I just want you guys to keep some of these titles in mind. So when you're researching, if you stumble upon some of these, or if you see that an article that you're reading comes from one of these, you know that you're on the right track. To just to give you an example, okay, or many examples. So here are some really good journals about American literature. And again, people who write for these are professors, independent scholars, people who have done a lot of work on the texts. Okay, they might be considered literature experts. So here are a few titles. American Literature. Pretty obvious. That's the name of one journal. Another one is called American Literary History. Okay, keep that in mind. Another one is called Contemporary Literature. If you are looking at a text that's more contemporary, it came out fairly recently. Another one is Arizona Quarterly. You might see that. English there's one called ELH, English Literary History. That's mostly centered around English texts, but they do cover some American ones as well. Then we have American Studies, American Quarterly, Critical Inquiry, that's a good one. Early American Literature, that doesn't apply for many of us, but that covers texts from before 1820. So if you're working with an old text, an old American work of literature from before 1820, that could be a good journal to look for and consult. Also, American Literary Scholarship. So this is actually an annual put out by American Literature, that first journal that I mentioned. And it basically just reviews a lot of the work that's been done in American literature that year. So this comes out once a year, and it's kind of just like a recap of some of the best work that's been done in the field of American literature for that year. So it's kind of a review of the previous year's scholarship. Okay, so that can be a good place to look. Again, it's sort of cataloging and discussing a lot of different criticism that's come out recently. Okay, you're also going to notice what we call like single author journals. There's a lot of these. So they're sort of centered around one particular famous author. So just as an example, there's the Emily Dickinson Journal. Now, not every single article in that journal will be about Emily Dickinson. Of course, most of them will be. But in some cases, there might be articles that discuss some of her contemporaries, influences on her, writers that she might have influenced, but yeah, of course, most of the work in that journal is going to be about Dickinson. So almost any really famous American author will have a journal devoted just to them. So there's a Walt Whitman journal, there's a Melville journal, there's a Henry James journal, there's one devoted to Poe called Poe Studies. For more contemporary authors, this might not be the case, but for anybody who's been studied and taught for a long time, there's often going to be a journal just devoted to that author. So those can often be good places to look, depending on the author that you are working with. And then there's also college English. This one might show up in a lot of searches. This is a good one to use. Often the articles might be a little bit more on the short side. This is a journal put out by NCTE. That's the National Commission of Teachers of English or something like that. That's the governing body. So a lot of times this journal's kind of geared towards teachers. But obviously students can use it as well. And then there's also the Journal of Popular Culture. That's not exclusively about literature, but there'll be a lot of articles about literature in there. So those are just a few. There are many more, but just to give you an idea of kind of what we want, what we're looking for, those are the kinds of journals that we want. And just make sure you're clear on how academic journals work. So a journal looks a lot like a magazine, or you might even compare them to literary journals, like where people publish fiction. If you guys ever look at those. It's important to keep a distinction in mind, though. An academic journal about literature is different than a place where people publish literature. Okay? So be aware of that, and also be aware that an academic journal, while it kind of looks like a magazine, it's different than a magazine, right? But it's the same in that it has articles. All right, there's a bunch of different articles within a single issue of a journal. Okay, and each one of those articles will be written by a different person, a different scholar. Okay, so just be clear on these different levels. If you're looking at, say, American Studies, if that's the journal that you're looking at, there's a bunch of different articles within that journal. Each article has a different author, right? But ultimately, when you're doing a citation for that source, you'll need to include the author who wrote the article, the title of the article, and also the journal where that article originally appeared. And that's where you include American Studies or American Literature or the Journal of Popular Culture, whatever. So sometimes people get confused on those levels. They'll call the article the journal, or vice versa. No, articles appear in journals. Okay, so another thing that you guys can do is you can search for specific journals. You can look. You can even maybe visit the websites of these journals, because many of them are digitized. They exist online. They have online catalogs, or they have kind of like online archives where you can go back and access older issues of the journal from previous years. Now, sometimes they want you to pay for that. I can't guarantee that you'll be able to do all of this for free, but it wouldn't hurt to visit some of these websites, or you can just search for specific journals in the databases. That's another option. So as you get started, as you start searching, I would recommend writing down some specific research questions and some specific search terms that you can use. Because as we know, research, it's detective work. It can feel a little bit like a fishing expedition sometimes. You have to kind of cast a wide net. You have to try a lot of different leads. I'm kind of mixing my metaphors here, but you get the picture, right? You have to put a lot of time in, because you're not always going to find great sources right away. right? You can't just take the first 5 search results and say, okay, there's my 5 sources. You have to look around, and you might want to try a few different databases, a few different journals, and a few different search terms. So you can start with really basic searching strategies. Like you can always just do a search of the title of your chosen text. So whatever you're going to write about, you can just search for stuff about it. And that's good to do at this early stage as you're, like we said, learning more about the critical conversation, acquainting yourself with what people have been saying. Just search for the title. And if it's a pretty well-known text, and most of these are, you're going to get some results. You can also search for your author, okay? It's not a bad thing. I don't want everybody to do a ton of bio, but it doesn't hurt at this early stage to just learn a little bit more about the author. And that's another way to just find stuff that's been written about your text. Because, if you search for John Steinbeck and you look through a bunch of things about Steinbeck, you're likely to find something on Cannery Row because that is one of his more famous books. Maybe not as famous as Grapes of Wrath, but it's been written about a lot. So if you're searching through stuff on Steinbeck, you'll find some good potential sources on Cannery Row. So you can start with your title and then your author. But after that, you might want to get a little more creative with your search terms. You might want to try a few other things. You might want to try some keywords, not just titles and authors, but you might want to start searching for just like important concepts, things related to the text, or, themes, or, symbols that people talk about a lot, things that have been, sort of covered and analyzed a lot. There might even be a way to search specifically for that stuff, and that might be productive. Or if you think your text is really strongly affected by historical context, you could also search a little bit for more information about the historical context. This sometimes feels a little overwhelming to consider, but not all of your sources have to be specifically about your chosen text. Most of them should be, right? Or maybe they're about your author at least, but sometimes you might have a source or two that really are just focused on the history or the culture surrounding your chosen work of literature. That's okay. That's not going to be true of everybody, but that might be true for some of us, especially if we're thinking about using a critical approach like New Historicism. You might want to end up doing a little bit of historical research as well. Again, not all of our research has to be 100% connected to literature. But obviously you want your history to be connected to whatever is going on in your chosen text. But if you want to look around for maybe some historical sources or maybe some stuff from social science, then EBSCO can come in handy for that. You don't really have to stick with MLA International Bib for that stuff. Obviously you can use just a more general database like EBSCO or JSTOR. So remember that you have a few different ways you can go with research. You can obviously just find a lot of sources about your chosen text. That's fine. You can also have some sources about your author. That's also fine. And you can also have maybe a source or two that aren't specifically about your text or your author, but they're about the Great Depression or World War II or whatever, major historical event you think is factoring in to your text. So, with Sweat, which is one of my favorites that we've read this semester, an article about the Great Recession would be helpful. It doesn't have to talk about Sweat. It doesn't have to talk about Nottage. It just needs to be about the historical context that influences the text. So that's fine. But it will take time to gather the sources that you need. I want 3 to 5 reputable academic sources for this paper. So don't expect to find all of them tomorrow. Don't expect to find all of them, by the end of this week. Give yourself some time. Try on different search strategies. Try a few different search terms, and do some reading. Don't feel like every potential source that you read has to end up being a source that you use. You might read it, like it, learn from it, but then decide, what, I'm not actually going to use that on my paper, but I'm glad I read it. I know more now than I knew before I read it. So just because you read something or download something doesn't mean you're married to it, doesn't mean that you have to use it on the final paper. So I'm giving you guys like a 2-week window to really get all of your research done. So don't feel rushed. You have this week, week 12, and you have next week, week 13, to find the sources that you want. Okay, and if you have questions, of course, let me know. But before we go, let me just talk a little bit about outlining and getting started on some of those early idea generation, pre-writing strategies. I'm not going to bore you guys with a whole lesson on the writing process, even though I would like to. I'm assuming you know what the writing process is, you've heard about it, and if you don't, I'm not going to get into it right now, but just we probably understand, if nothing else, that we can kind of break this rather large process down into a few different steps and stages. And typically how we do this is we identify pre-writing. That's everything we do before we start writing. That's stage 1. Then we have stage 2, drafting. That just means writing, creating your initial draft. And then, you'll have to do some additional drafts. And then finally, post-writing is the final stage, and that consists of revising and editing. So for now, I just want to think about pre-writing. All the stuff that we do before we actually start writing the paper. So this really consists of brainstorming, note-taking, and outlining. So going back to your chosen text. Once you know what you're going to write about and you've read a little bit about that larger critical conversation surrounding it, I want you to just start taking some notes, jotting down some ideas. Now, hopefully you've already annotated the text itself, the work of literature that you're going to write about, but if you haven't, I want you to annotate it, underline, circle, highlight, and jot down some notes in the margins. If you have a hard copy of the book, do it in the book. If you don't want to mark up the book because you're hoping to sell it at the end of the semester, fine. Just take your notes on a separate sheet of paper, and anything that you would have highlighted, you can just maybe jot it down or make a note about it so you can go back and find it quickly. If you're using an online version of the text, you might be able to annotate on your computer. And at the very least, if you find the text in the book, but you don't want to mark up the book, maybe you can find another like PDF or something online, print that out, and mark that up. Whatever works for you, but you need to take notes. Get some stuff down on paper. And then I would really encourage you guys to go back into the text. And this is one of the things you can really be doing as part of your note-taking. But you need to start finding some specific passages that you can work with in your paper. This is very important. I always like to emphasize this. I talk about this in 203 as well. But you really need to start finding some potential quotes. You need to find some specific scenes, some specific moments, some specific passages. Remember when we were close reading, I was telling you to find specific passages, like a couple of paragraphs, maybe even just a couple of sentences. Keep doing that. You don't always have to close read that stuff, but you need to find specific moments. This is going, these are all going to help you to provide textual evidence. You need quotes. You need to summarize specific things that are happening. Now, I don't want a lot of plot summary, but if you're talking about a pivotal moment in the narrative, when a lot of important information about these two characters might be revealed. You can summarize what's going on in that moment. I don't want a summary of everything that happens in the text. I've read these texts. I know what happens. Okay? So you never need a summary like that. But you might want to talk about what's happening at this moment. Provide some context. What's going on with these characters? What just happened? What's the tension? What's the, conflict that they might be addressing? So you can do a little bit of that. You can quote directly. That's always helpful. Don't do it too much, but we like good direct quotes to help us make our points. And also just find specific stuff that you can talk about. You need to start identifying specific features that you want to explore. Again, this should be in your notes. I'm interested in this symbol. I'm interested in these two characters. I'm interested in these two metaphors. I'm interested in historical context. I'm interested in how this character might express a feminist perspective. Whatever. Okay? There's not a lot of rules for pre-writing. There's a great clip from this old sitcom where I used to be able to show it. I can't find it anymore, but I would show it to my old live classes where our character says, "There's no judgment in brainstorming," and that's absolutely true. I mean, it's meant to be funny, but this is true. You can write down anything. You're not married to any of this stuff. You're generating ideas. You're figuring out what you're interested in, what you want to say. And like I was telling you last week, you're looking for that entry point. How do I get in to an analysis of this text? How do I get into the existing critical conversation about this text? You're looking for that point of entry. You're looking for something that you can do, something that you can contribute, something new that you can offer. So that takes time. You're not going to figure that out in an hour. But if you sit down with your text, that's going to help. Take notes. And then once you start to have some idea of what your argument might be, jot down that tentative thesis statement because you're going to need to return to that later. We obviously will need good thesis statements eventually. But once you have an idea of what you think you're going to do with your paper, then I would go back into the text and then you can really start looking for examples. Textual examples that you can use in the body of your paper. Because we need a lot of these. A lot of you have probably seen at some point in some of my feedback some mention of textual engagement. Maybe you've heard that before. That's really all I'm talking about. To engage with the text just means to talk about it specifically. To talk about it on a level beyond a plot summary. Beyond what we find on the paper mills and the summary websites, right? You're engaging by talking about specific features and expressing your ideas about those features. So we're not just talking about what happens in the plot. We're talking about symbols. We're talking about setting. We're talking about historical context. We're talking about how figurative language expresses larger ideas or whatever. Okay, so engagement can really only occur if you're going back through the text and finding specific passages, specific quotes, specific moments that you can use and talk about. Okay, some of it will be evidence. Other instances will just be things that you want to explore, things that you want to talk more about. And maybe those are things that you want to find out more about through research. So don't forget about research questions. As you're getting started, you might want to jot down a few questions that you have about your text. These can be just basic questions about like how to interpret it. What do I think a key theme is? Like, what do I think this moment means? What does that symbol mean? Maybe you're still trying to work out certain parts of your own interpretation. That's fine. Jot those questions down. Maybe you have some questions about the author. Maybe you have some questions about the genre. What genre does this belong to? How does this text get talked about? Does it represent certain trends or developments in American literature? Does it represent certain characteristics of Gothic literature, or a thriller, or some other type of genre, right? Or a particular type of poetry, which might have certain rules and certain intentions built in. So there's a lot of different things you can do, but you really just have to start finding your angle. What do you want to say, and how are you going to say it? So in the old days, our professors would always say, mark up your books. Go back into your chosen text and mark the hell out of it. Highlight it, highlight important passages, underline important stuff, jot down your thoughts, your questions, your ideas, and that's a great way to get started. In the modern age, when so many of us read online, or we want to keep our books pristine, it can be a little bit harder to take notes, but I would just recommend starting a Word doc or just doing this by hand in a notebook so you can get some ideas down on paper. Okay? And once you've done that, you'll be ready to start outlining. We're not really going to outline yet. We can really talk more about that next week. But just remember what an outline is. It is a plan for your paper. It's like a blueprint. Think about building a house. You wouldn't just start building a house without some kind of a plan, something to guide you, a structure to shoot for, goals to try to achieve, right? So think of the paper as a house. We have to build this thing, and before we build it, that's really the drafting stage. That's when we write. But before we can do that, we need a plan or a blueprint. So that's really what the outline is. And ultimately, what we want to do in the outline is we want to plan every paragraph that we intend to write, starting with our introductory paragraph, and then all of our bodies, and then, of course, the conclusion. That takes time. Next week is really our outlining week, so I'll talk more about it then. But before you can outline, I want you to do all of the stuff that we talked about today. So choose the text that you want to write about. Start doing some of this preliminary research where you're just learning about the critical conversation, learning a little bit more about your text and your author. Make sure you have all the basic info, publication date, name of author, maybe the genre that this text belongs to. Obviously, tell me if it's a short story, poem, novel, play, whatever. So get the basics. Do the preliminary research, and then go back into the text, take notes, highlight, all that stuff. And once that's all done, we'll be ready to start outlining. So if you have questions about the assignment, email me. If you want to run a topic by me, if you want to maybe do a comparison, or you have a text in mind, but you're not quite sure that it's going to work, and you want to talk to me about it, that's great. Email me, reach out. We'll talk this week if you want. And remember, you have to talk to me in week 14. So we'll look at those conference schedules next week in my final lecture. So remember, next week, week 13, we're outlining. You have a final lecture from me. And then in week 14, we're just conferencing. And then by week 15, we are simply working on papers. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.